Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. Today we'll start to talk about the different functions of the digestive system or the gastrointestinal system. And first we'll talk about, I will give a small introduction about the gastrointestinal function. Then I will cover the salivary glands and the swallowing reflex in the later half of this lecture. The objectives of the first part of the lecture are to identify the organs of the digestive system, to describe the structure and function of the layers that form the wall of the gastrointestinal tract or the alimentary canal, to describe the basic processes performed by the digestive system, and discuss the regulation of the GI tract or the alimentary canal function. And when we talk about the regulation, usually we mean mainly the neuronal and hormonal regulation. The organs of the digestive system can be grouped into two main groups. The first group are the organs that form the gastrointestinal tract or the alimentary canal, and it starts from the mouth, then the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, the three parts of the small intestine and the different parts of the large intestine. And as we see here in this figure, we can see that the alimentary canal starts in the mouth or the oral cavity, then pharynx, esophagus, stomach, then the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and the different parts of the large intestine, and finally ends into the anus. And the other groups or group of organs of the digestive system are the accessory digestive organs, and these are organs present around the alimentary canal or the main gastrointestinal tract, and these are the teeth, the tongue, the three pairs of the salivary glands, the parotid glands, submandibular glands, and the sublingual glands, and also the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Now if we take part of or any part of the alimentary canal or the digestive canal or the digestive tract, and we check the composition of the wall of that tube or that digestive tube, basically the wall of any part of the alimentary canal is composed of four main layers, and these four main layers are the mucosa, the innermost layer, that is composed of epithelium, lamina propria, and muscularis mucosa, then followed by the submucosa, which is loose connective tissue that contains blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerve fibers, and also it is the house of the submucosal plexus. Then the muscularis or muscularis externa, which is composed in most of the parts of the alimentary canal from an inner circular muscle layer and outer longitudinal muscle layer, and these two layers are separated by very important plexus called the myenteric plexus or plexus of Auerbach. To note that most parts of the alimentary canal, we are talking from the stomach down to the large intestine, the muscularis externa is composed of smooth muscle cells, except for the esophagus we can find some striated muscles. The fourth layer, which is the outermost layer, is the serosa, that is composed of an areolar connective tissue and a layer of simple squamous epithelium. So what is the mucosa? The mucosa is a moist epithelial layer that lines the lumen of the alimentary canal. Its three major functions are secretion of mucus, absorption of end products of digestion, and this happens mainly in the small intestine, protection against infectious diseases because it acts as a barrier between the external environment or food in the lumen of the alimentary canal and the blood. It consists of 3 layers, lining epithelium, a lamina propria, and a thin layer of smooth muscles called the muscularis mucosae. The mucosa epithelial lining consists of simple columnar epithelium and mucus secreting goblet cells, and this is true for the entire alimentary canal except for the esophagus, where the esophagus is lined, or the epithelium of the esophagus is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The mucus secretions protect the digestive organs from digesting themselves. Lubrication, and this will ease food along the alimentary canal. The stomach and small intestine mucosa contains enzyme secreting cells and hormone secreting cells, and we'll see that in the stomach and the small intestine, and to some extent in the large intestine we have gastric glands, and we have the intestinal glands, the crypts of lubricant. The other layers, the submucosa, muscularis and serosa. The submucosa is a dense connective tissue containing elastic fibers, blood and lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes and nerves. The muscularis is responsible for segmentation. The contraction of the circular and longitudinal layers is responsible for the segmentation and peristalsis, and these are movement patterns that happen in the alimentary canal. The muscularis externa of the upper part of the alimentary canal is composed of voluntary striated muscle fibers, and these are found in the mouth, pharynx, and the upper 2/3 of the esophagus and the anal sphincter. The involuntary smooth muscle fibers elsewhere, apart from the organs that are mentioned in the previous point, are smooth muscles that are arranged in inner circular fibers and outer longitudinal fibers. And a very important plexus called the myenteric plexus lies between the two muscle layers, the inner circular and the outer longitudinal. The serosa is the protective visceral peritoneum. What are the functions, or the function, or the main function of the digestive system? Here we can see that the digestive system in this figure is one of the systems of the body. The GI tract, or the alimentary canal, is a disassembly line. It is where digestion of food constituents into simple molecules takes place in order to absorb these molecules or these particles in their simplest form. So the main functions of the digestive system are mechanical and chemical breakdown of food, and this will make food very simple molecule that will be absorbed into the blood. And the third function is elimination, because not everything that we eat or we swallow will be digested and absorbed. Remnants will be eliminated as solid waste in the form of fecal material. There are 6 basic processes that are performed by the digestive system, and these 6 basic processes that are performed by the digestive system will allow the digestive system to perform its function efficiently. These are ingestion, secretion from the accessory glands, propulsion and mixing, digestion, both mechanical and chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion is due to the contraction and relaxation of the muscles in the wall of the alimentary canal. Chemical digestion is the function of enzymes. Fifth function is absorption of nutrients in their simplest form, and then elimination of any non-digested material in the process of defecation. So as you see here, we have ingestion, secretion, and then we have mechanical digestion or breakdown, and we have the chemical digestion. We have the propulsion in the form of swallowing and peristalsis, that we'll study them in details in the coming slides and the coming lectures. Then absorption, which is the main function of the alimentary canal, and finally the elimination of non-digested, non-absorbed material in the form of fecal material in the process of defecation. So what is ingestion? Ingestion is the process that involves taking food and liquids into the mouth by eating and drinking. Secretion. Secretions are provided by many accessory organs. Salivary glands, liver, pancreas, and the mucosa of the esophagus, stomach, small and large intestines secrete a total of about 7 liters of water, mucus, acid, bicarbonate, which is a buffer, and enzymes into the lumen of the alimentary canal each day. And as you see here in this figure, the salivary gland will produce about 1.5 liters of saliva per day, 1.5 liters of gastric secretions from the gastric glands in the mucosa of the stomach, about 1 liter of bile from the liver, and about 1 liter of pancreatic juice from the exocrine part of the pancreas, 2 liters from the intestinal mucosa, from the intestinal glands or crypts of Liberkin in the small intestine mucosa, and small amount of 200 ml of secretion from the large intestinal mucosa. Functions of secretions. Number 1, lubrication, because secretions are rich in water and mucus. Some contents of secretions, like the gastric HCl, can kill pathogens. Another function of the secretions is buffering of the gastric acidity. Bicarbonate in bile and bicarbonate in the pancreatic juice will buffer the hydrochloric acid that is delivered with the chyme from the stomach into the duodenum. Another function of secretions is chemical digestion. Salivary glands contain saliva contains salivary amylase, and pancreatic juice contains a lot of pancreatic enzymes that help in chemical digestion or chemical breakdown of food particles. Most of the volume, and we said it is a total of 7 liters per day, most of the volume of the secretion is reabsorbed back, and very small amount is lost in the fecal material. So after these secretions perform their function, the majority of the secretions are reabsorbed. Propulsion and mixing. Alternating contractions and relaxations of muscle in the walls of the gastrointestinal tract mix food and secretions, as well as they propel them towards the anus. So the contractions are helpful in the mixing of food with the secretions and also propel them downward towards the anus. One of the motility patterns or propulsion motility patterns is swallowing, and the other pattern is peristalsis, and we'll study these two patterns in details in the coming slides as well as in the coming lectures of the digestive system, inshallah. The fourth basic process of the digestive system is digestion, which is very, very important for proper absorption of nutrients. We have two types of digestion. We have mechanical digestion. The teeth will cut and grind food before it is swallowed. Smooth muscles in the stomach and small intestinal wall will churn the food or will tear the food. Food molecules become dissolved and thoroughly mixed with the digestive enzymes. As we can see here, a motility pattern called segmentation help in dividing the food bolus into parts and mixing them together. So we have more mixing and more homogeneous mixing of the food with the secretions. The other form of digestion is chemical digestion. Digestive enzymes produced by the salivary glands, the gastric glands, the exocrine pancreas, and the small intestinal glands will not the small intestinal glands, the digestive enzymes present on the brush border of the small intestinal mucosa will split the large carbohydrate, lipid, protein, and nucleic acid molecules present in food into smaller molecules by process of hydrolysis, and these smaller molecules can then be absorbed easily through the mucosa of the small intestine. Absorption, the fifth basic function. Absorption is the ultimate goal of the digestive system function. The movement of fluids ingested and secreted, whatever we eat, plus the secretion of the glands, and also ions as well as the simple nutrient molecules. These are the products of mechanical and chemical digestion from the GIT lumen into the blood and lymph vessels. This is the process of absorption. So these fluids, ions, simple molecules will move from the lumen of the alimentary canal into the blood and lymph vessels, and then these nutrients, fluids, and ions will circulate to the cells throughout the body. 90% of absorption takes place in the small intestine. So the small intestine is the major site for absorption that occurs in the digestive system. Here we can see a summary of how large molecules or food particles like carbohydrate, lipids, and proteins are digested into simple molecules. For example, carbohydrates with the action of salivary amylase will be broken into disaccharides, trisaccharides, and those are then broken into monosaccharides by the brush border enzymes present in the apical or the brush border of the enterocytes or epithelial cells of the small intestine into simple monosaccharides that can be absorbed and enter the blood to circulate throughout the body. The details of the chemical digestion will be covered in biochemistry, inshallah. Defecation, which is the last basic process of digestion. Wastes, indigestible substances, bacteria, cells sloughed from the lining of the GIT, and digested materials that were not absorbed in their journey through the digestive tract leave the body through the anus in a process called defecation. The eliminated material is called feces or fecal material. And here we can see a figure showing what is defecation. Now we'll talk about regulation of the GI tract functions. The regulation is neural or neuronal, and we have hormonal. So the neural control is achieved by the neurons, and we'll talk about them in details in the coming slides. And we have hormonal control via the gastrointestinal hormones, and we'll discuss those hormones in details in the respective lecture. The neural regulation of the GIT is via intrinsic control, and this is achieved or performed or under the control of intrinsic nerve plexuses, and we call these intrinsic nerve plexuses the enteric nervous system or the nervous system of the alimentary canal. It is also called the gut brain because the total number of neurons in the enteric nervous system is more than the total number of neurons in the spinal cord. It is a very important neuronal or neural plexus that controls the functions of the alimentary canal, both motility and secretion. Nerve plexuses in the GIT initiate short reflexes. short reflexes are mediated by local enteric plexuses. And as I said, these plexuses are called the gut brain. Also, another neural control of the GIT is via the extrinsic control. The extrinsic control is via extrinsic innervations, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Long reflexes arising outside the GIT. They are long because signals are sent to the CNS and the orders or impulses come back from the CNS to the alimentary canal. That's why we call them long reflexes, which is opposite to the short reflexes that are just present inside the wall of the alimentary canal in the case of the enteric nervous system. Extrinsic control involves CNS centers and extrinsic autonomic nerves. The enteric nervous system, or the gut brain, is composed of two major intrinsic nerve plexuses, as I explained in the introduction. We have the submucosal plexus, we have a submucosal plexus which is present in the submucosa, and we have a myenteric plexus that is present between the inner circular and outer longitudinal smooth muscle layers of the muscularis externa, the third layer of the alimentary canal wall. As you can see here, we have sensory neurons that are getting information from the mucosal epithelium. They will carry information to the submucosal plexus and to the myenteric plexus, and here we have the integration or control center either in the submucosal plexus or in the myenteric plexus. This control center will send information through motor neurons either to the glands in the wall or in the mucosa or to the circular and longitudinal smooth muscle layers of the muscularis externa. As you notice that action potentials to the smooth muscles of the muscularis externa arise from the myenteric plexus, and this is logic because the myenteric plexus is present between the circular and longitudinal layers of the alimentary canal wall. Impulses arising from the submucosal plexus will go through motor neurons, and this usually will control the secretion. So the main function of the myenteric plexus is to control motility, and the main function of the submucosal plexus is to control secretion. Submucosal nerve plexus regulates glands secretion and smooth muscles in the mucosa, the muscularis mucosa, the very thin layer that is of smooth muscles present in the mucosa. The myenteric plexus is major nerve supply that controls the GIT motility. The enteric nervous system regulates digestive system, motility, secretion, and blood flow. Neurons in the myenteric plexus can extend, or the myenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus is present or extends from the esophagus down to the anus. The myenteric plexus is linked to the central nervous system via long autonomic reflex arcs, as we can see here, that also impulses will travel to the central nervous system, and then motor fibers will come back through the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system to modulate or alter the activity of the myenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus. The extrinsic innervation, as we have studied in the autonomic nervous system lecture, which was the third lecture in this course, is via the autonomic nervous system. So extrinsic set of nerves that modulate the activity of the enteric nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic is shown here, or the fibers are shown in blue, craniosacral origin, and the sympathetic, the thoracolumbar division, because it arises from the thorax and the lumbar spinal cord. It is shown in red. The parasympathetic is excitatory. The general rule in the digestive system that the parasympathetic division is excitatory. It increases muscle activity and increases the glandular secretion. The sympathetic, which usually acts opposite to the parasympathetic, it will decrease the muscle activity and decrease the glandular secretion. And we know that the parasympathetic system is the system of rest and digest. So that's why the digestive system is active when the parasympathetic system is active. Here we can see a summary of the neural control of the GIT. We can see, as I said, we have stimuli that stimulate mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors in the mucosa or in the wall of the alimentary canal, short reflexes that occur through the local enteric nerve plexuses. The submucosal and myenteric will produce a response by acting on the effectors, which are the smooth muscles or glands of the alimentary canal. Also, stimuli carried to the central nervous system as part of long reflexes will be processed in control centers present in the central nervous system, and then the efferents coming through the sympathetic and parasympathetic will modulate or will change or will affect the activity of the local enteric nerve plexuses, and this is called the long reflex arc. Now let's talk about the gastrointestinal hormones that are involved or that control the digestive functions. We have a very important hormone called gastrin. It is released from the antrum of the stomach, and we'll study that in details inshallah in the next lecture. It increases acid secretion. We have another important hormone called cystokinin or CCK. It is released from cells present in the mucosa of the duodenum. It stimulates the gallbladder contraction and the pancreatic enzyme secretion. We have another hormone called secretin, produced also from the small intestine glands. It inhibits acid secretion and stimulates pancreatic bicarbonate secretion. So the main effect of secretin is to reduce the acidity of gastric chyme that is delivered to the small intestine, to protect the small intestinal mucosa from the erosive effect of the low pH that is brought to the duodenum by the gastric chyme or emptying of the gastric chyme. There is another hormone called gastric inhibitory peptide, GIP, released from the small intestine. It inhibits gastric motility and stimulates insulin secretion. Another important hormone, motilin, released from the small intestine. It increases gastrointestinal motility and stimulates the production of enzyme pepsin. These are the main hormones that control the gastrointestinal function, and we'll discuss them in details in the respective lectures of the digestive system, and again inshallah in phase 2 in the digestive module. With this slide of hormones we finish the first part of the lecture. Now let's go to the second part of the lecture, which is salivary secretion and swallowing. The objectives of this part of the lecture are: identify the locations of the salivary glands and describe the functions of their secretions, describe the location, anatomy, histology and functions of the esophagus, describe the 3 phases of deglutition or swallowing. Starting with the salivary glands, we have major salivary glands and we have minor salivary glands. The major salivary glands, we have a pair of parotid glands, a pair of sublingual glands, and a pair of submandibular glands, as you studied in the anatomy lectures. We have some minor salivary glands that I will mention them in the coming slides. A salivary gland is a gland that releases a secretion called saliva into the oral cavity. Ordinarily, just enough saliva is secreted to keep the mucous membranes of the mouth and pharynx moist and to cleanse the mouth and teeth. When food enters the mouth, however, secretion of saliva increases and it lubricates, dissolves, and begins the chemical breakdown or chemical digestion of food. We have major and minor salivary glands. 3 pairs of major salivary glands. These are the parotid glands, the sublingual glands, and the submandibular glands. Minor salivary glands include labial, buccal, palatal, and lingual glands. So these are minor salivary glands. What is the composition of saliva? As other fluids in the body, the main constituent of saliva is water that comprises 99.5% of saliva. Then we have about 0.5% of saliva in the form of solutes like ions including sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, and phosphate. Dissolved gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, organic substances including urea and uric acid, mucus, immunoglobulin A, lysozymes, which is bacteriolytic enzyme, salivary amylase, which is a digestive enzyme that acts on starch, because the digestion or the chemical digestion of starch can start in the stomach. And lingual lipase, a digestive enzyme that is released from the lingual salivary glands, which are lingual minor salivary glands. It is a digestive enzyme that acts on triglycerides. Functions of saliva. Saliva has several functions, and these include moistening and lubrication, because saliva is very rich in water and mucus. The water provides a medium for dissolving foods so that they can be tasted by the gustatory receptors or the taste receptors. Mucus lubricates food so it can be moved around easily in the mouth, formed into a ball, and swallowed. The other function of saliva is protection. Immunoglobulin A or IgA prevents attachment of microbes to the mucous membrane so they cannot penetrate the epithelium. So it just coats the microbes and prevents their attachment to the mucous membrane and subsequent invasion of the mucous membrane by the microbes. Also, the enzyme lysozyme is bacteriolytic, so it kills bacteria and protects us against invasion by this bacteria. Bicarbonate and phosphate ions that are present in saliva, they will buffer the acidic food that enter the mouth. So this will keep the pH around 6.35 to 6.85, and this will prevent dental caries, because acidity in the mouth will cause tooth resorption and can cause dental caries. Also the saliva aids in the chemical digestion of carbohydrates, because saliva contains salivary amylase, and chloride ions that are also present in the saliva are important to activate the salivary amylase. Also, the lingual lipase can digest the dietary lipids or dietary triglycerides. Another function, or the fourth function, is removal of waste molecules from the body. And the waste molecules, or the two main waste molecules that are mainly removed by the kidney but to some extent into saliva, are urea and uric acid. Salivation, or the process of saliva production. The secretion of saliva is called salivation. Amounts of saliva secreted daily vary considerably between people, but the average is between 1 to 1.5 liters. It is controlled, or the salivation or the saliva production is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic system is stimulatory, so it will increase salivation. The sympathetic system is inhibitory on the alimentary or the digestive system, so it will decrease salivation. The taste of food also is a potent stimulator of salivary glands, independent of the parasympathetic stimulation. The smell, sight, sound, or thought of food may also stimulate secretion of saliva. Now let's talk about digestion in the mouth. Mechanical digestion in the form of chewing or mastication. Food will be manipulated by the tongue, ground by the teeth, and mixed with saliva. This will form the food bolus that it will be ready for swallowing or deglutition. Another form of digestion that also happens in the mouth is the chemical digestion. Salivary amylase secreted by the salivary glands acts on starch and contributes to the act until inactivated by the stomach acid. So the salivary amylase will start digestion in the oral cavity and will continue until the bolus will reach the stomach, because this salivary amylase is inactivated by the low pH of the stomach. Only monosaccharides can be absorbed in the mouth. So if we have carbohydrates in the form of monosaccharides like glucose, this glucose can be absorbed across the oral mucosa, but if it is in the form of polysaccharide, disaccharides, or trisaccharides, these are not absorbed in the oral cavity. They have to reach the small intestine to be further digested to monosaccharides and then absorbed across the small intestinal mucosa. Lingual lipase, that is secreted by the minor salivary glands, lingual glands of the tongue, acts on triglycerides, but it is only active or only activated when it reaches the stomach, because it needs an acidic environment. So it becomes activated in the acidic environment of the stomach and thus starts to work after food is swallowed. Now let's talk about the last part of the lecture, which is the esophagus, the tube that extends between the pharynx and the stomach. Structurally, its wall is composed of mucosa that protects against wear and tear, submucosa that contains blood vessels, lymphatics, neurons, and the submucosal plexus, the muscularis externa. We have different types of muscle fibers in different parts. The upper third contains only striated muscles, the middle third mixture of striated and smooth muscles, and the lower third smooth muscles. Please don't make the common mistake and don't say the upper third is composed of skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscle means the muscle attached to bone. Esophageal muscles do not attach to bone, but they have only striated appearance under the microscope that's similar to the skeletal muscles. So the correct term to be used for the muscles in the upper and middle third of the esophagus is to say striated muscle fibers. The esophagus has two sphincters, an upper esophageal sphincter that regulates the movement into the esophagus, and the lower esophageal sphincter that regulates the movement of food from the esophagus into the stomach. The last layer of the esophageal wall is the adventitia. There is no serosa that covers the esophagus from the outside. It is adventitia or connective tissue that attaches the esophagus to its surrounding structure in the mediastinum. Function: the esophagus secretes mucus, transports food. It doesn't secrete enzymes, so there is no chemical digestion and there is no absorption in the esophagus, especially if we know that its mucosa is composed, or the epithelium of the mucosa is composed of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, which is relatively thick compared to the simple columnar or simple cuboidal or columnar cells in the epithelium of the remaining or the other parts of the alimentary canal. Deglutition or swallowing: it is the act of pushing a food bolus from the oral cavity through the pharynx to the esophagus and then from the esophagus into the stomach. So the movement of food from the mouth into the stomach is achieved by the act of swallowing or deglutition. It is facilitated by secretions of saliva and mucus. We said saliva is very rich in water and mucus, and these are very important for the facilitation of swallowing. It will ease the movement of food bolus down the esophagus into the stomach. Deglutition involves the oral cavity or the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus. Deglutition occurs in 3 phases or 3 stages, and these are the first phase, which is voluntary and called the Buccal Phase, which means involves the oral cavity. It is the voluntary passage of the bolus to the oropharynx. Then we have the pharyngeal phase. It is involuntary passage of food bolus through the pharynx into the esophagus. And finally we have the esophageal phase, which is again involuntary passage of food bolus through the esophagus to the. So this is the buccal phase. The buccal phase begins with the compression of the food bolus against the hard palate. Subsequent retraction of the tongue then will force the bolus into the oropharynx and assists in the elevation of the soft palate, thereby sealing off the nasopharynx. Once the bolus enters the oropharynx, reflex responses begin and the bolus is moved towards the stomach in an involuntary way. The pharyngeal phase, which is an involuntary phase, begins as the bolus comes into contact with the palatoglossal and palatopharyngeal arches and the posterior pharyngeal wall. Elevation of the larynx and folding of the epiglottis direct the bolus past the closed glottis. So this will ensure that no food bolus will enter into the respiratory tract or the airways. At the same time, the uvula and soft palate block the passage back to the nasopharynx, and this also will ensure that no food will enter into the nasopharynx. So the airways are closed and the food bolus will be secured to pass through the pharynx across the upper esophageal sphincter into the esophagus. The esophageal phase, here we can see it begins as the contraction of the pharyngeal muscles forces the bolus through the entrance to the esophagus or the upper esophageal sphincter. Once in the esophagus, the bolus is pushed toward the stomach by a peristaltic wave that is called primary peristalsis. The approach of the bolus triggers the opening of the lower esophageal sphincter or the LES as an abbreviation. The bolus then continues into the stomach. When the bolus enters the stomach, the lower esophageal sphincter will contract to avoid the regurg of the gastric content into the lower esophagus. So let's explain each phase one by one. The voluntary buccal phase is the first stage in swallowing, is the voluntary act of the tongue forcing the bolus to the back of the oral cavity and into the oropharynx. The pharynx has digestive as well as respiratory functions. It is a common tube that is shared by the respiratory system and the digestive system, because food and air passes through the oropharynx to the respective tract. So the pharynx has digestive as well as respiratory functions, and swallowed food must transit the pharynx on the way to the esophagus, and it must do so while not going into the nasal cavity or the trachea or the larynx or the airway. The pharyngeal phase, the involuntary pharyngeal stage, begins as the bolus passes through the oropharynx. Receptors there in the mucosa will send impulses to the deglutition center in the medulla and pons. Returning motor impulses cause the soft palate to move superiorly and posteriorly to close the nasopharynx. The epiglottis moves slightly inferiorly to close the glottis. So the airways are secured closed. The esophageal phase, the involuntary esophageal stage of swallowing, begins once the bolus enters the esophagus. It passes the upper esophageal sphincter. Then peristalsis, which is a progression of coordinated contractions and relaxations of the circular and longitudinal layers of the muscularis externa, will push the bolus onwards and downwards towards the stomach. The contractions are repeated in waves that push the food towards the stomach. As the bolus approaches the end of the lower end of the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter will relax to allow the bolus to move into the stomach. With this, we finish today's lecture. I hope it was interesting. Please don't hesitate to ask me any questions by email. Thank you very much, and see you in the next lecture.